Distinguished speakers and dear participant, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to a very special webinar on the future of China-Europe engagement. To briefly introduce NICE, Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy, and world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflicts are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. China Studies is one of our major research centers. China Studies as a whole brings into perspective the rising powers mounting economic, military, and diplomatic cloud that certainly has the aptitude to either overturn or sustain the current contemporary world order. The center broadly examines China's international strategy, thinking and conduct, foreign and security policy, and the impact of domestic politics and economy on China's foreign relations. We have been holding regular interactions on China's with experts from around the world. To talk on a very interesting topic of today, we have very distinguished scholar, Dr. Ivana Karásková from Association of International Affairs, Czech Republic. Dr. Ivana Karásková is a China Research Fellow and a project coordinator at the Association for International Affairs, AMO. Dr. Karaskova focuses on conceptualization of influence, Chinese foreign and security policies, China's presence in Central and Eastern Europe, and China's position in international global order. She holds a PhD in international relations from Charles University and other university degree in journalism and media studies and European studies and international relations. Since 2014, she has been a lecturer in China geopolitics, Europe-China relations, and security in Northeast Asia at Charles University. She completed research and studied in China at Fudan University, East China Normal University, and Taiwan at Tamkang University, Chengchi University. In 2009-2010, she was a Fulbright scholar at Weatherhead East Asian Institute at Columbia University in New York. She is an alumna of the US State Department's International Visitors Leadership Program, IVLP, on investment screening mechanism, a Czech Republic member of China expert pool at the European Center of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats in Helsinki, and a European China Policy Fellow at MERICS in Berlin. She presented her research to members of European Parliament and US Congress and was quoted in Al Jazeera, Financial Times, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, Deutsche Welle, Foreign Policy, Le Monde, Radio Free Europe, Neue Zürcher Zeitung, Le Temps, China Digital Times, Sunday Morning Herald, and others. Her research finding appeared in the New York Times, US-China Economic and Security Commission's 2018 annual report, Rapporteurs Without Borders report on vulnerability of media, US Congress hearing, and others. Dr. Karaskova, once again, welcome to our program. Kindly make your remarks in around 30 minutes, which will be followed by question and answers. This program is streaming live on Facebook and several other platforms. We'd like to request all our participants to drop their questions on Zoom chat or on the Facebook Live. You can also tweet your questions if you like. Dr. Ivana Karásková, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jaiswal. And thank you very much. NICE, by the way, you have a very nice acronym, for having me today. It's a great pleasure. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on the location you are joining in. As the time is limited, I think I will jump directly into the presentation I prepared for you today, which should not last more than 30 minutes. I will try to limit myself to that. So I'm going to start sharing my slides. Hopefully you see what I see.
Yes, we can see.
Perfect. So when I was preparing this very brief talk to you today, I was wondering how much into the detail I actually can go, because sometimes we in Europe feel that everything is known to everyone. But I have to admit that the European Union has been puzzling for a number of locals as well. And sometimes we basically do feel that it is necessary to explain and to go into lots of details when Europe is concerned, and then we figure out that basically everything is known. So please bear with me, because I try to strike some kind of a balance between going into too much detail and basically gliding on the surface. So the topic of my speech today is the future of China-Europe engagement, which is a very, very difficult topic now to predict, but I will try nevertheless. A few words for the background, because I decided to focus on this very difficult balance Europe is trying to strike when it comes to China between economic engagement and its economic benefits it has from cooperation with China and the security threats it feels it now has to somehow tackle. So when it comes to economy, we have to put it into the context of China actually being quite a rising power continuously over a couple of past decades. And we are now talking about the world's biggest economy in PPP and number 2 in global domestic product. For EU, China is the 3rd largest partner for EU exports and the largest partner for EU imports of goods. So it has been even constantly rising on these 2 fronts as well. So it is an important player. It is an important economic partner, but on the same time, it's also considered in Europe as a strategic rival and competitor. So first to the fact how we have to look at China and how to basically balance this very difficult relationship between need for access to Chinese market for our products and in the same time being, I wouldn't probably shy away from using the word addicted to some of the cheap products which are flowing from China to European market. So as you can see, the imports are actually rising, but so do the exports, yet the balance is still quite negative in EU's disfavor. It's not only about the goods, it's also about services, and it's also about the access of European companies to Chinese market. So I prepared here a very short SWOT analysis looking at the strength of the EU, opportunities in China, weaknesses of the EU, and threats in China. So when we look at the strength of the EU still has quite a favorable position when it comes to its technology and its know-how, and that's kind of a sex appeal for Chinese market to allow European companies, especially in various segments or sectors, which are important to, are we still live? Because something disappeared here. Is the connection working? Is the connection working? Hello?
Hello? Hello?
Yes, is it still working? Yes.
No, we could not see the slide. Could you please share it again?
Yes. Something disappeared from my screen for a minute.
Now we can see it. Yes.
Perfect. Thank you very much. The tricks of technologies. So as I was saying, the European technology prowess is something still what China is interested in. And that's one of the reasons why it is still allowing European companies, especially in various sectors, to operate on the Chinese market, and it has been so for a number of decades. The high quality of products and services, and also the reputation of the European products, is something which plays into the strength of the European Union in China. On the other hand, the problematic parts being the strong currency, which basically makes the imports of the European goods quite expensive for the local customers, and the high risks for small and medium enterprises. This has been changing over the couple of years towards European companies being, let's say, less satisfied with their treatment in Chinese market. So that's something which has been a constant pain on the European side, and something which the European Commission has called for a number of years to actually level the playing field between Chinese companies on the domestic market and the foreign companies. On the other hand, putting this into one basket, all the problems which the companies encountered on Chinese market, being it the necessity to subscribe to the Chinese legislation targeting foreign companies, to problems in competition on the Chinese market, problems with subsidies of the Chinese companies, and so on, is on the other hand leveled with some of the opportunities in China. And despite what I will be saying in a couple of minutes later, that the European companies, especially German companies perhaps, are getting more and more vocal on the problems they are facing in China, and perhaps more prone towards diversification of risks, of willingness to invest into other markets and basically diversify from China and de-invest from China. There are still huge opportunities in the Chinese market. So there is no big exit seen by European companies from the Chinese market, despite, as I said, a number of problems on the domestic front, the problems with the supply chains, the lockdowns in China, and so on. So still the European companies are hanging in Chinese market, but yet they are getting more and more vocal about the fact that their competitiveness may be getting a little bit strangled by the Chinese companies and also by the Chinese state. That leads me towards the threats which they are facing in China. And once again, for a number of years, without basically fully and successfully resolving these issues, companies have been vocal about the forced technology transfers and the discriminatory treatments, weak international property rights enforcement, subsidies which are basically dismantling or crippling a little bit the Chinese market, and so on. But put it into the objective front, really. It's not just the Chinese companies which are benefiting, of course, from the partnership with their foreign counterparts. The foreign companies have also had for a number of decades access to cheaper labor, of course, to less stringent control of environmental and work safety standards. So with the European Union moving towards cleaner energy, moving towards more stringent control of environment and so on, these companies have been basically relocating their production, we can even say dirtier production, to other parts of the world, including China. So originally, the Chinese companies were quite welcome in European Union and a single market, basically treated as other companies or other Asian investors. This has started to change in 2016, 2017. 2016, if you do recall, a Chinese company was trying to buy the German appliances maker, and that started to trigger the security concerns. Because when we look at the data, which unfortunately I didn't include here to the slides, when you look at the data, there has been a number of or influx of Chinese FDI targeting European companies, especially companies in several sectors, high-tech sectors and segments, or the segments which may have military implications. So that triggered concern on the European side. And since February 2017, initially 3 countries, France, Germany, Italy, started to discuss a possibility to hold Chinese takeovers of European companies, especially those who are producing the so-called important technologies. Those discussions evolved into EU investment screening mechanism, which was adopted in October 2020, or implemented in October 2020, adopted a year earlier. What that means is that any extra EU company or investor, so doesn't matter whether it's an Indian investor, Chinese investor, Japanese investor, US investor, entering into the European market and investing into specific segments of critical infrastructure, for example, or media, could be a subject of investment screening. But the investment screening is not coming with the possibility of blocking the investment by the European Commission. That's still the competition of the member state. So the member states decided, some of them at least, to adopt their own more strict investment screening mechanisms. And that allegedly not closed the window for the Chinese takeovers of European critical companies, but at least limited the influx of Chinese FDI, uncontrolled influx of Chinese FDI. And it also created a mechanism for sharing information among EU member states with the European Commission as well on what exactly China is interested in investing in Europe. So on the one hand, that was a security concern from the European Union, from the EU member states. On the other hand, it was also a bargaining chip with China to get a fairer access of European companies to the Chinese market. Whether it worked or not, I will leave to your assessment. So since 2016 or 2017, there were a number of legislation targeting economic sectors or segments of cooperation with China. So we do see a trend in the European Union being more aware of the fact that Chinese investment may not be without any strings attached, may actually come up with some security considerations. So two pieces of legislation I would like to discuss here before I move forward. And one is something which currently is in the freezer, the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, or the so-called CAI, which was originally proposed still in the period of, let's say, honeymoon between EU and China in 2013. And it was quite surprisingly and very hastily, I would even say, concluded in principle in December 2020. It was 2 years ago, it was quite controversial because the agreement was reached very quickly, as I said. It was reached on insistence of the Chinese side, who wanted it to have it before Biden, the US president, is actually sworn in. And there was a considerable pressure from certain member states on other member states to actually conclude and sign the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment in principle. Well, in theory, this CAI is quite significant because it eliminates, for example, joint venture requirements. It should stop forced transfers of technologies, and it should stop also quantitative restrictions and so on. In practice, it has been criticized from a number of directions because there wasn't, as I said, an internal agreement by all member states that CAI would be actually of benefit to European Union. There were constraints or trust issues, if I may call it this way, because Xi Jinping made several other pledges before repeatedly on eliminating joint ventures requirement, on the end of forced transfer technologies. So the question mark over the CAI was, how is CAI different this time? Would Xi Jinping or would China actually fulfill the requirements of CAI? And then in March 2021, the EU, at the beginning of 2021, the EU decided to sanction some of the individuals and state bodies in China in connection to atrocities in Xinjiang, which provoked sanctions from the Chinese side on several members of the European Parliament, think tanks, and individuals. And it basically put the whole CAI into the freezer because European Parliament is supposed to ratify the treaty in the end. But the members of the Parliament already signaled that unless the sanctions are lifted, they are not going to proceed with CAI. So still, European Commission is working on comprehensive agreement on investment. Still, there is something happening on this front, but the ratification process is very unlikely, at least in the foreseeable future. And last but not least, what China may see as a piece of legislation which is directly linked to its activities and actions in Europe and across the globe, basically, is the newly prepared anti-coercion instrument, which was triggered by the Chinese sanctions on Lithuanian goods. These were non-official sanctions, so basically problems with the bilateral trade, which China never acknowledged it has, but Lithuania reported that it's experienced. And that was triggered by the country's decision, first of all, not to participate in the format for cooperation between China and Central and Eastern European countries, and then by the renaming of Taipei's representative office in Vilnius to Taiwanese representative office. So the mechanism is quite interesting because it should help the country which is sanctioned or which is under the economic coercion, and basically financially help it to leverage those losses which it may experience. Simultaneously, the EU appealed to World Trade Organization to investigate the case of China's activities taken against the goods coming from Lithuania. So this story is not over and far from over, actually. And we may see more of the frictions between China and the European Union triggered by this sanction process on Lithuanian goods. So just to sum it up, the EU's long-term demands has been basically the same over a number of now decades. The EU wanted China to end the non-tariff barriers, which as a member of WTO, it should not actually employ at all. EU wanted China to open the sectors which are now still closed for the foreign investment, and the subsidies, and end the forced transfer of technologies and forced joint ventures. So these are some of the very long-standing demands, if you wish, or requests or grievances that EU actually has on China. On the other hand, there are new ones, as to end the economic pressure which is applied to one of the EU member states, Lithuania. But that all seems quite, I would say, rosy, that everybody is on board among the EU member states. It's far from that, actually. There is a trajectory and a trend, let's say, seen across the European Union. But on the other hand, we still have to take in consideration that a number of the countries have very different approaches to economies. Some are more open economies, some are, let's say, less prone to protectionist measures taken in their domestic economy. So there are, let's say, different interests, but the trajectory, I would still argue, is the same, towards more control of the EU single market and towards more awareness of the security problems connected to Chinese investments in Europe. Well, the second big part which plays the role in this balance, and we just discussed the economy on one hand, are the human rights. And in China, sometimes the position on human rights is that the European Union is a slightly hypocritical actor, if I put it mildly here. But the problem lies in fundamental difference in the position on human rights in China, or in Asia in general, if you want, or in the European Union, stemming from very different historical experience. So for EU, the individual rights are more important than state sovereignty, and it has been seen on a number of occasions, a number of documents. And if you look at the front page of European External Action Service, you will actually find the human rights mentioned at the very forefront. That's not the position of China, and we may delve into that a little bit in the discussion. So that's stemming from let's say, two different approaches. Yet the EU cannot get rid of that approach. It has been built on its Enlightenment historical experience. And as a core, it sees itself as a normative civilian or civilizing power. So it is in the treaties that the EU stands for human rights, for the role of law and democracy. And these are not just figurative words, these are actually words which shape also European policies. And to give you some examples, political conditionality and stress on political dialogue is a part of association and cooperation agreements. Inclusion of explicit goals in human rights protections is a part of development aid provided by European Union. And there are specific instruments for promotion to human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. Well, we may argue that once again, because the European Union is not a single animal, it's actually composed of 27 different countries. So the key obstacles which lay into approach to human rights, especially when China is concerned, is that the human rights agenda mostly clashes with other states, mostly economic interests. So it has been a very difficult balance to basically balance the European interests and the interests of European customers and populations actually to have an access to, let's say, cheaper goods or alternatives on one hand, and on the other hand, to ask questions on what are the political conditions or what are the human rights conditions in China and how basically that affects European Union. So European Union has been criticized, of course, on a number of occasions by different stakeholders, including the European NGOs, activists, and so on, of not taking the principled approach sometimes, or not being very tough on China. But I have to really reiterate that this is a very delicate balance and very difficult balance sometimes to achieve, even among the different domestic audiences in one single country, not to mention the whole European Union. Once again, if we look at trajectory, there is visible trajectory towards being more willing to criticize China on human rights abuses. And though I would argue that this line of thinking or this line of underlying theme has been present in European Union for decades, I would still argue that when it comes to China, we do see significant change and the increase and willingness to speak critically about human rights abuses in China since 2018 or 2019 in connection to the new let's say, anti-terrorist campaign of China in Xinjiang, in connection to Hong Kong protests in 2019, and last but not least, in connection to COVID-19, which basically meant that the issue of China started to enter into domestic discourses, and the issue of how certain Chinese products are produced and what kind of actor China actually is, started to be more and more present in basically everyday lives of Europeans, because really of COVID-19, which touched upon the whole European population. What the EU would like China to do, of course, has been repeated on a number of occasions. So I'm not going to go over that to save time, basically. It's true that China and European Union used to have a human rights dialogue to solve all these issues. Since 1998, the human rights dialogue have been halted on China's request, or China basically signaled that it doesn't wish to continue in discussions with the European Union. The human rights dialogue has been achieved some progress, of course, and it has been an interesting avenue for discussion with China on those issues, mostly issues which were not necessarily put forward to the European population or made public, but still they achieved something. On the other hand, some of the NGOs and activists criticized European Union for using this opportunity just to signal that the EU is taking care of the human rights or is interested in human rights issues. But the progress, according to some of the NGOs, was quite minor. Nevertheless, the dialogue continued until recently, but it has been a major source of annoyance for China, though it participated until quite recently. To speed up here a little bit, I would like to mention 2 points of contentions here, which are Xinjiang issue and Ukraine war. The Xinjiang issue ventured into the economic arena actually when the Magnitsky Act, which was used to sanction 4 Chinese citizens involved in running the so-called re-education camps, provoked Chinese sanctions on members of the European Parliament, which in turn signaled that they will not ratify comprehensive agreement on investment. So that was basically the first bit to punish China on human rights grounds since Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. And it was quite interesting to watch that the members of the European Parliament did proceed with using the Magnitsky Act, and did actually signaled quite a strong resolution to condemn the human rights abuses in the Xinjiang region. When it comes to Ukraine, it may be even more interesting, I would say, because that has the direct impact on the current relations with China. China signaled rhetorical support of Russia even before the invasion. And it signaled after the invasion that it's not willing to condemn Putin for starting the invasion. On the contrary, the global messaging for the global South, and by the way, Central and Eastern European countries in European Union are considered by China also as a global South, portrays Russia as a victim and calls for NATO to revert its boundaries into pre-1997 state. So basically excluding the Central and Eastern European members of NATO. And it also claimed that NATO expansionism was the cause of the invasion of Russia, that Russia had to attack Ukraine because of NATO. And I use that picture here because in some of the messaging, especially to Central and Eastern European countries, China used the word Voldemort to describe NATO. So that was too interesting to pass on, I would say. What that created was very interesting, or fairly interesting, because Central and Eastern European countries, those 17 members of, 12 members of European Union located in Central and Eastern Europe, so almost half of the EU in terms of the numbers, took it very, very badly, because China necessarily said that they, the NATO members, are responsible for the war in Ukraine. It led to further exits from the former cooperation between China and Central and Eastern Europe, when Lithuania left in 2021, Latvia and Estonia left in 2022. And most likely that would provoke more exits from other member states, such as Czech Republic or possibly Romania. Those countries in Central and Eastern Europe call for revision of state or relations with China. They are willing to consider China on par with Russia, so treat China in the very same manner as a country ruled by authoritarian regimes. And they also realize that if they want to be critical of China, or if they want to look for alternatives, such as Taiwan, there is a very low price to pay, as the case of Lithuania actually showed, or as the case of the visit of the Czech Senate president in 2020 showed, almost nothing actually happened. So the EU internally is now in a position where it is crucial for at least some of the EU member states for China to condemn Russia, not to be seen as a part of this Sino-Russian all-weather alliance. There has been increased concerns, as I mentioned, since 2016 to 2017, which materialized into legislation, which materialized also in practical actions, such as the use of Magnitsky Act. And frankly speaking, after the last summit of death between the EU and China, there seems to be a very small or narrow pool of topics the EU and China can actually work together, or there is this perhaps even an unwillingness to find positive agenda with China. For a number of years, it used to be climate change for specific reasons connected to energy crisis. Currently, I would say that climate change is not the primary topic for discussion between China and the EU, though most likely this topic would probably still be the one which would be discussed, the lowest hanging fruit, just to say it as such. European companies, especially German companies, started to receive signals from their home governments that they would be left on their own if they want to continue operating in Chinese market, if they don't take precautions, if they don't diversify, and so on. And in general, China's image in Europe worsened quite significantly in connection to Xinjiang, but mostly in connection to COVID-19 crisis, and in Central and Eastern Europe in connection to Ukraine war. The last slide here, and then I will conclude. What would be the next? Well, that's the very difficult prediction to make, and the symbolic graveyard of China scholars is basically full of false predictions. So I will basically try to stay with my feet on the ground. It very much depends on three actors: on China, on EU itself, and of course on the US, which is the third part of this triangle. And we can't basically omit US in those discussions on Sino-EU relations. So it very much depends on China's position towards Russia and China's position on the war in Ukraine, and how China would be able to persuade, especially members in Central and Eastern Europe, that its Sino-Russian alliance may be just an alliance on paper, but it's not the alliance which would transform into practical deeds. It also, of course, depends on how the EU would like to position itself on this, let's say, symbolic triangle between the US and China. It is, of course, interested in playing still the independent pole and having the strategic autonomy. On the other hand, with the unraveling of the war in Ukraine and the energy crisis and so on, it's highly unlikely that in the short term, the EU would actually do have significant capacities to be an autonomous player. While I'm not saying it's not autonomous, let's focus on autonomy or strategic autonomy as envisioned by the French President Macron and the others as well. And of course, it also depends on how the relationship between US-China will evolve, who will be the next US president, and basically how, what kind of confrontational / detente approach we may actually see in the foreseeable future. So I would like to stop here and basically reiterate that my main point for this very short remarks was that the EU is currently facing a very difficult balancing act between its economic priorities and the fact that the EU, as also other regions in the world, has been hit by inflation and by the rising prices of energy, and how it will balance its commitment, which is really stemming from its own thinking of foreign policy and all the founding treaties and so on human rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ivana Karásková. Thank you so much for that comprehensive and enlightening presentation. We have touched upon a wide range of issues, and we have received lots of questions from the audience. So without delay, let me share some of them. First is that how is Ukraine crisis going to impact China-Europe ties? That is one. And second is, what is the fate of BRI projects in Europe? Maybe we'll take two questions and then move to other.
I will try. Well, just to sum it up, I think I probably already answered the question, which probably came before I ventured into the Ukraine crisis. basically, to sum it up, it all very much depends on China. I think that the ball is on the Chinese side, and it would have to do more than just send missions to Central and Eastern European countries, which are trying this very difficult dance of persuading the local populations and local politicians that the Sino-Russian alliance is basically just something on a paper, and it's not an alliance, it's perhaps a partnership. So it is a lot of very, very difficult diplomatic dance. But for Central and Eastern Europeans, the fact that China didn't condemn Putin, that China actively disseminated those anti-NATO narratives, is making more, or is weighting more actually than any number of Chinese delegations. We just had another delegation in Czech Republic. I think it was a fourth delegation since the invention started, and they were received, but they received very cold shoulders, at least in Central and Eastern Europe, as I'm aware of. When it comes to the BRI, how does the EU's Global Gateway project compare with China's attempt, the BRI? Well, the BRI in a number of regions for probably objective reasons has been stalled, or there is nothing that much happening on that front. One of the reasons could be, of course, the Chinese Party Congress and the obsession with the power struggle, which is absolutely understandable, of course. The other could be the domestic problems connected to COVID-19 control. But most likely, Belt and Road Initiative, though is going to be rebranded to the Security Initiative, is not going anywhere. It's a pet project of the current leadership. Most likely, it will probably transform to something slightly different, but those projects are still on the table and would continue. As for the Global Gateway, I have to say, or I have to confess that I'm not an economist, so I'm not, or an expert on development aid, so I'm not I'm not following that much. But after a very, very slow start, which resembled to some extent Belt and Road Initiative, because it puzzled a lot of local observers of what the Global Gateway actually is and how this is going to perform. It seems that it is actually going to be consolidated and going to focus on the EU's priorities, especially in infrastructure. So I would probably leave it to that the Global Gateway is at the beginning, and the Belt and Road Initiative, though is going to be rebranded, is probably not going anywhere. So we will see more or less, I wouldn't say competition. I think there is a complementarity in those initiatives in the future.
Thank you. There are lots of other questions, like you just mentioned about Xinjiang issues. So do all the European countries have similar stand on the issues of Hong Kong and China's Uyghur issues? If variation, what are those? That is one. And second is that on economy, like in recent times, several countries are working for decoupling of their economies from China. What is Europe's stand and how it is going to impact Europe? And then another question on the same line. Is it possible to disassociate the trade relations between Europe and China from their geopolitical ambitions to the Indo-Pacific? How does Europe hope excite its strategic autonomy while balancing US and China in the region?
Mm-hmm. So I will try to briefly respond to these. The question on whether there is some kind of unity when it comes in perception, when it comes to Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and so on. I wouldn't argue that there is a unanimity or unanimous stance and that all countries basically perceive, because we are talking about a number of countries, perceive it in the same vein. I would argue that there are countries which are more prone towards human rights agenda than others. And some of those countries, but not necessarily all of them, of course, are found in Central and Eastern Europe for the fact that the local politicians, but most crucially, perhaps the local population, has this very similar view of or looking at their own history through the prism or make it even more complicated, I think. So they are looking at Taiwan issue, for example, or Hong Kong issue through the prism of their own history, thinking that those entities or countries, or however you would like to name them, are the subject of bullying of the local big power. And that very much resonates with the experience of some of the Central and Eastern European countries being subjugated to expansionism of either Germany before and during the Second World War, or the Soviet Union. So there is this mental link or affinity by certain segments of local society to look at all those issues from the prism of the democratic entities being suppressed by authoritarian regimes. So there is very little knowledge, I would say, on what exactly it constitutes, to be Tibetan, for example, or Hong Konger, or Uyghur, or Taiwanese. So the knowledge is not perhaps the most advanced, but it is still this, let's say, ideational affinity which drives local populations to support politicians who find these issues on their agenda. So there is a popular demand for that. It's not resonating, as I said, across whole European Union, but there are countries such as the Czech Republic, for example, all the Baltic states, which are more prone to pushing to, let's say, unconventional measures. And if you look at the number of visits, for example, in Taiwan recently, these are, of course, not only Western European politicians who are visiting Taiwan, but also, of course, Central and Eastern European politicians. So once again, not a unity, but definitely those issues started to venture into local domestic discourses, and through that into national domestic discourses, and through that to European national discourses. So on the question of decoupling, I don't see Europe actually decoupling from China in the sense that we have seen, for example, debated in the US during the last administration, Trump administration. The position of Europeans is more that they would like to diversify, that it's not a good idea to put all the eggs into one basket. It may not be the very good idea to concentrate certain production in just very few provinces in China. So the diversification is happening across China. So basically companies diversifying from the coastal provinces towards Western provinces or central China. And in the same time, the diversification is happening when it comes to other Asian countries. So relocating to Vietnam, to Indonesia, to India. There was a let's say, call during the COVID-19 crisis to relocate completely from China to basically upgrade the domestic production of European Union. This is not going to happen across the board of all the sectors because it's simply not economically feasible or profitable, but it's going to happen perhaps in certain critical industries to have those relocated to allied countries or to countries which are geographically close by. And here, for example, Western Balkans could be a very interesting area to watch. And the last question, which I somehow haven't tackled yet, is that how does EU hope to exercise its strategic autonomy while balancing US and China in the region of Indo-Pacific? I would say that the Indo-Pacific strategy of the EU is still in a nascent phase, and it has been matched by the domestic or national Indo-Pacific strategies. So Germany has an Indo-Pacific strategy, Netherlands has one as well, UK has one, France has one, of course. The Czech Republic, the country without the Navy, has Indo-Pacific strategy as well, focusing on other segments such as space cooperation or cybersecurity. So these are, I would say, the beginning of the tide to look at Indo-Pacific. The big question mark, of course, is how exactly those European countries and EU as a whole should position in respect to China. So the Indo-Pacific strategy, according at least to my view, should not be a response to Chinese activities in the area. It should be based on genuine interest of European Union towards countries in Indo-Pacific. So it has to also search for synergies and for the agenda which would be pushed for by the Indo-Pacific countries.
Thank you so much. Let me move to next question. What is Europe's response on Huawei 5G program? And second is that recently China has announced Global Security Initiative and Global Development Initiative. So what is Europe, how is Europe reacting to it?
Yes. So first on the Huawei issue, there is no Europe-wide ban on Huawei, of course. That's the competence of the member states. So still the national governments are the prevailing actors in this respect. Some countries, I would say, decided to move towards, I wouldn't say probably excluding, let's say not welcoming Huawei and ZTE in their 5G networks and the networks of the future generation as well. Some countries were more cautious in basically signaling, and it was an interesting development, at least for me, for signaling to the local business community that if they proceed with products in their networks which were produced by Huawei or ZTE, those operators may not find themselves succeeding in the tenders for national networks, for example. So that was an interesting move because the governments didn't have to take responsibility for banning or allowing. They basically made outsource this decision to the business community. And the business community decided basically to exclude Huawei and ZTE products from their networks, at least temporarily, because they were not sure how they would actually stand if they try to compete in public tenders. So that's quite an elegant solution, I would say, because it doesn't provoke any retaliation from the Chinese side. It's a business decision. But on the other hand, it very much depends really on the European Union economic standing in the future, because what is once again weighted here is the question of security and autonomy, perhaps, and the question of economic profitability, because the Huawei products are, of course, significantly cheaper than the alternatives. So to sum it up, no EU-wide approach to banning Huawei. It's still the national governments which are taking the actions, and some are, let's say, more critical, and some are less critical in this respect. The question on Global Security Initiative and Global Development Initiative, well, my reading is that it's basically a repackaging of Belt and Road Initiative so far. And it's quite soon to say how exactly these two are going to be different. I think that it's basically just, as I said, repackaging. And most likely we will not see much of the development, of course, before the Party Congress, which is approaching, but most likely in 2023.
Thank you so much. We still have around 5 minutes and we want to get best out of it. So maybe last two questions, or maybe last three. And the Europe has changed its perceptions of China between 2019 and 2020 from a strategic partner to a systematic rival. Do you consider that in order to maintain a strategic stability, Britain should adopt a revisionist or a hostile policy towards China? That is one. Second, is it possible for China to replace US in Europe, as US is a trusted partner in the West? Over to you.
Thank you very much. These are interesting, very interesting questions. Yes, I would agree that this very difficult trifecta, and I use that in my PowerPoint slides, that this very difficult balancing act between seeing China as a partner, as competitor, and as a rival, has been moving towards seeing China as a strategic rival. And that's the decision which has been made by China, I would say. I would not argue that this is something which Europe would somehow invent based on its own perceptions without any factual basis. And it's very much influenced by the war in Ukraine. It may be seen as European problem, it may be seen globally as a trifle problem, but it's the problem which basically occupies and preoccupies European Union. And I would argue that China misunderstood how sensitive and how difficult this is going to be for Europeans to swallow. So I don't see currently much of a positive agenda unless China somehow makes the trick, somehow basically solve this problematic part it drove itself into, or with the European Union being dragged in the war for a couple of months or years, maybe that would somehow solve itself, and we will move further. But in a very foreseeable future, I really do not see much of a positive agenda, or going back to seeing China as economic partner and competitor, but more as a rival, as I said. Very interesting question of whether China may replace United States in Europe. I actually do not see any area where this may happen. For Europe, it has been once again a very delicate balance of economy and security, and because of its lack of capacities for power projection and for lack of defense capacity to a certain extent, it has to rely on United States or the NATO if you want to extrapolate to a broader setup. So this is not going to change miraculously overnight, though of course the EU and the member states are already pledging that they would like to increase their defense budgets. This will definitely move in a direction of spending more on the defense and less relying on the NATO support. But in a very foreseeable future, to mid-foreseeable future, I would still say that militarily, US would be still needed on the European territory, or would be still needed as a security partner in transatlantic relations. When it comes to economy, well, there is definitely a space for China to be much more present in Europe. Depends on, of course, which segments, which sectors, and how exactly this would happen. There is an aptitude for China to invest in greenfield, in brownfield as well. There is less aptitude for China to invest in basically to do mergers and acquisitions, and especially in certain critical industries. That's for sure. As for the perception of China in Europe, well, we are currently seeing probably the bottom of the curve, and with the wolf warrior diplomacy and with the anti-NATO rhetorics, I don't see any improvement anytime soon. But to sum it up, I would really say that the ball is on Chinese side, and the Chinese administration or the Chinese leadership after the Party Congress, which consumes all the energy and attention, would have to reconsider how exactly to approach European Union if it wants to, of course, approach the EU.
Dr. Ivana Karásková, thank you so much. I, on behalf of NICE and all our audience, would like to thank you for your kind presence and valuable time. We hope to have you in real, maybe in Kathmandu in future. We'd also like to thank all our audience for their wonderful questions. Thank you and have a nice day.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and have a very nice day.